Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. We talk about the cloud all the time, right? We talk about it as if it's this ethereal, wireless, magical place where all our data just kind of floats around. But the stark reality? The internet is actually a highly physical, incredibly vulnerable piece of infrastructure sitting completely out of sight at the very bottom of the ocean.
So, seriously, think about this for a second. What happens when a 6,000-kilometer extension cord suddenly snaps? Because that is exactly the physical setup our modern digital existence relies on, and the stakes for keeping that cord intact are astronomically high. Just consider this staggering number for a moment: 99%. Almost all of our transoceanic and international telecommunications traffic, we're talking every email, streaming video, and cross-border Zoom call, travels not through high-tech satellites up in space, but through these physical underwater cables. And if you want to understand just how much we rely on this, look no further than this figure: $10 trillion. That's the estimated value of global financial transactions passing through these exact cables every single day. One major international bank alone moves almost $4 trillion daily just to manage its settlement networks. So this isn't just about internet browsing, it's literally the beating heart of the global economy.
All right, let's move into Section 1, the Internet's hidden backbone, glass threads in the deep.
It's honestly kind of counterintuitive that our wireless, highly mobile modern world actually relies on fixed tubes lying in the mud at the bottom of the sea. But here's the crazy part. Despite carrying the weight of the entire global economy, these cables are tiny. Most of them are only about the diameter of a garden hose. They have copper conductors and protective plastic layers, sure, but at the absolute core are these hair-thin strands of glass. And surprisingly, despite their massive importance, they're incredibly benign to marine life, leaving a really minimal footprint on the seafloor.
Now, tracing the history of this global network reveals that it didn't just happen overnight. It started way back in the 19th century with underwater telegraphs, then shifted to telephones in the 1950s, and finally evolved into the fiber optics we know today from the 1980s onward. So, the crucial takeaway here is that modern data cables are literally layered right on top of historical maritime and colonial trade routes. Geography dictated the physical paths of power back then, and honestly, it largely still does today.
Which brings us to Section 2, Fragility Beneath the Waves. Everyday threats.
As incredibly engineered as these cables are, the ocean floor is a harsh, totally unforgiving environment, and these tiny garden hoses are surprisingly vulnerable. Out of the 150 to 200 cable faults globally every single year, you might assume it's mostly, high-tech espionage. But the reality is beautifully mundane. A massive 70% of damage is caused by human maritime activity. We're talking mostly fishing nets, from bottom trawlers or ships just carelessly dragging multi-ton anchors that can penetrate meters deep into the seabed. Natural hazards make up about 12%, and actual component failure, that's just 4%.
Okay, I absolutely have to bring this up because it's pretty much everyone's favorite internet myth: sharks biting the cables. This stat perfectly busts that myth. According to the data, between 2007 and 2014, there were exactly 0 cable faults caused by fish or shark bites. 0. I mean, it makes for a super fun headline, but we really need to redirect our attention back to the actual threats, which are humans and nature.
And speaking of nature, consider turbidity currents. These are essentially massive, high-velocity underwater avalanches filled with dense sediment. They're triggered by earthquakes or severe storms, which, by the way, are only getting worse with climate change, and these currents flow rapidly down underwater canyons and can snap multiple cables simultaneously, completely blinding entire regions in an instant.
Let's look at Section 3, the complex repair mission, fixing the backbone.
So what actually happens when they break? Well, the entire repair process relies on highly specialized ships. This is exactly why cable owners heavily demand DP2 class ships over DP1. DP stands for dynamic positioning. A DP2 ship has built-in computer and thruster redundancy. Basically, if a system fails in rough seas, the ship holds its exact position. Think about it. If a ship were to drift while hauling up a cable, it could just snap the line all over again, or even damage nearby oil and gas pipelines. Extreme precision is absolutely everything here.
The actual fix? It's basically like finding a needle in a haystack and then operating on it inside a floating clean room. First, the ship drags a grapnel hook to snag and cut the damaged cable on the seafloor. Next, they haul up one end, test it, attach it to a buoy, and drop it back into the water. Then, they go retrieve the other end, bring both of them up to a sterile room on the ship, and meticulously fusion splice a new section of spare cable directly into those tiny glass fibers
And finally, they can't just toss it back overboard. Because they've added new spare cable to make that splice, they have to lower what's called a repair bight. This is an omega or hairpin-shaped loop, and it's carefully laid down using acoustic release hooks so the cable doesn't snap from its own weight as it reaches the bottom. It is a highly, highly delicate dance. Moving on to Section 4, Trillions on the Line, the Cost of Disconnection.
Just imagine what happens to a modern economy when its primary digital lifeline is suddenly severed. The daily financial losses are just devastating. For a highly connected country, an internet outage costs an estimated $23.6 million per day for every 10 million people. Without connectivity, banking stops, e-government halts, and supply chains entirely break down.
And look, this isn't just theoretical modeling. Let's look at these real-world examples from our sources. In 2022, a volcanic eruption in Tonga caused a total communications blackout for a whole month, completely isolating the nation during a huge crisis. In March 2024, a cable cut impacting Nigeria resulted in a massive $600 million economic loss, taking their banks offline. And back in 2023, Taiwan's Matsu Islands faced 6 entire weeks of digital isolation when both of their cables were severed.
This brings us to Section 5, Sabotage in the Gray Zone, the Attribution Challenge.
And this leads to a pretty chilling geopolitical reality. Nations have realized they can weaponize this structural vulnerability without ever formally declaring war or firing a single shot. There is a very stark contrast between genuine accidents and intentional gray zone warfare. A real accident is unpredictable, scattered, and mostly just a product of everyday maritime error. Intentional sabotage, on the other hand, is highly strategic. It targets vital choke points and relies heavily on plausible deniability. Because really, how do you definitively prove that a commercial fishing boat dragging its anchor across a vital cable was doing it maliciously rather than just incompetently?
Global geography makes this incredibly easy for saboteurs. Consider this alarming fact. Over 90% of Europe to Asia communications funnel straight through Egypt's Red Sea subsea corridor. When you have that much critical data squeezing through such a narrow, congested choke point, it becomes a prime, highly attractive target for deliberate disruption.
History and modern events give us quite a few examples of these gray zone tactics. It ranges from exploiting those maritime accidents for deniability, like the allegations surrounding the Chinese-backed vessel, the Hongtai 58 that severed the Matsu Island cables, to actual deep-sea espionage. For instance, the U.S. successfully tapped Soviet military cables in Operation Ivy Bells during the Cold War. Superpowers across the board have long recognized the immense strategic value of either tapping into or denying these networks.
This perfectly highlights what analysts call the attribution challenge. As noted in the source material, maintaining just enough deniability paralyzes the international response. Because our maritime laws are heavily outdated and focus mostly on accidental damage, state-backed actors can easily disguise their sabotage as normal maritime mishaps, effectively avoiding any severe escalatory consequences.
Ultimately, this leaves us with a really powerful question to ponder. As our world moves entirely to the cloud, how long can we truly rely on a fragile glass thread at the bottom of the sea? It is a highly precarious physical foundation for our entire modern digital existence. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer to uncover the invisible lifeline beneath our oceans. Stay curious and keep learning.